Welcome, everyone, to the 7th session of the St. Paul's Ministry of Defense. Today, we're going to be discussing the often talked about problem of evil. So we as theists make two fundamental claims. We contend two fundamental propositions. First, that there are good reasons to think that God exists. And secondly, right, at a bare minimum, we claim that there are not comparably good reasons to think that God does not exist. And maybe for more ambitious, you might say something like, there are no good reasons to think that God does not exist. And so today, we're going to be examining that second claim, right? We've spent 3 sessions now examining the first. We've looked at the argument from contingency, the argument from objective morality, the moral argument, and the argument from design, which is a combination of the fine-tuning argument and then the argument from the applicability of mathematics. So we've seen good reasons to think that that first proposition there, that first claim is true. Now we're going to see why that second claim is true. So we're going to spend the next 2 weeks looking at the most common reasons that are put forward to think that God doesn't exist, and we're going to see why those reasons aren't so good after all, and we're going to gauge if they're any good at all, right? And I'm going to largely leave that to the audience, right? Just how strong of a claim they'd like to make. So what are we fundamentally doing here, right, in philosophy? Well, we're exploring reality, right? And then in the context of arguments for and against God, what we're doing is exploring fundamental reality. We're studying the origin of reality. And we're trying to explain the data of the world by reference to that original first cause of some sort, right? So the theist is claiming that there's this person, right? There's this community of persons actually, but this one being who's a personal being who's at the center of reality and who gives rise to everything else, who's omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, and everything else. The atheist is denying that claim. They're going to say that fundamental reality is not personal, right? That it's not this God. And so those are the two competing theories, right? And then of course agnosticism would be unable to make a determination, right, which theory is true. But what the two sides are trying to do is build a theory about the origin of reality. So the atheist philosopher Graham Oppy explains what we're really doing when we're building theories. He says that what we should do is, what a proper theory would do, is maximize explanatory power while reducing theoretical commitments. So breaking that down, right, that first point there, maximizing explanatory power. You can think of that as, what theory explains the most amount of the data. And we'll get into what that data might look like, right? But we have data all around us, right? Looking at the universe, looking at our own lives, looking at our experiences. What theory explains the most amount of that? Even if no theory explains all of it, what theory explains the most amount of it, right? Ideally, we'd want our theory that we're advancing to explain as much of the data as possible, right? We want to maximize that. But what we want to minimize is theoretical commitments, right? So we want to have few ripples or few negative or unideal consequences, right? Or corollaries to holding to certain theories. So this theory entails this, which is unideal, which we wouldn't want it to, right? Which is hard to believe or makes it less intrinsically probable or anything like that. We want to have few of those things. Those are called theoretical commitments. So we want to maximize as much of the data as possible in terms of explaining it, and we want to minimize negative consequences or entailments of that view. And so the theistic claim is that theism makes better sense of the total data than does atheism. So what might that data look like? Well, typically the data points that are put forward in favor of theism would be things like the contingency of the world, right? The fact that the world didn't need to be here, or the objectivity of moral values and duties, or the fact that the universe is fine-tuned for the possibility of the existence of life of any sort, or the mathematical applicability of the universe, or the fact that the universe had a beginning, or consciousness, or beauty, or religious experience, right? So these are all data points that are put forward in thinking that theism is true. These are evidences that give support to theism. At least they're traditionally associated with that. Now, what about for atheism? While the evil and suffering of the world, right, is often put forward as reason to think that God exists, or that God does not exist, and that's certainly data, right? We see evil and suffering all around us. Both moral evil, so people misusing their free will, and then natural evil, so sort of things like diseases, natural disasters, things that occur in nature, basically things that are not explained by free will. And of course, there are going to be combinations of the two. We have the hiddenness of God. It's the fact that God isn't immediately present to us in an undeniable way. So we might think that gives evidence for atheism, and that, on Christian theism, God is calling all of us to a personal relationship with himself and is asking us to give up everything for him, but yet we can't even see him. He doesn't even reveal himself to us in an indubitable way. So perhaps that gives reason to think that he doesn't exist. Do you think if somebody's going to call you to a relationship, right, with themselves, that they'd at least reveal that they actually exist, right, before they do that? So that's put forward as a data point that counts in favor of atheism. And then religious pluralism too, right? If we think that, God is all-powerful, he's one, he's all good, and he creates the world and wants us to follow him in a particular way, right? He's revealed himself in one way, right? Namely Christianity. Would it make sense to have a world with so much religious, plurality, right? With all the thousands of religions that exist and have existed? Is that really expected with this hypothesis that only one is true and that he, right, only wants us to follow him in one particular way? So that's data that is in our experience, right? Both of the world and upon interior reflection. So the question is, what theory is going to make sense of the most amount of data? That's the question for today. And that's what we're going to get into with the rest of this talk. So today we're going to focus on one data point in particular, and that's the data of evil and suffering. So it's undeniable, right, when we look around the world, that there's evil and suffering. There's torture, there's rape, there's burglaries, there's murders. There's so much depravity in the world of free creatures, right? In the actions of free human beings, constantly using that to hurt other people, to transgress them, to hurt them in some way. That's going on all over the world. There's likely billions of instances of it every single day, and it's been happening since the beginning of time. There's a lot of natural suffering around the world too. There's natural disasters that take the lives of thousands of people every year and that ruin the lives of millions more. There's children that are dying of debilitating diseases early. There's many adults of various ages dying, right, untimely deaths or experiencing intense suffering, right, in the last moments of life. So many people going through depressions and anxieties and all the different mental disorders. There's just so much natural suffering going on as well, not just amongst human beings, but also in the animal kingdom too. If we think of the fact that evolutionarily speaking, right, animals have been in the process of advancement for millions of years. And that process entails a lot of suffering. And around the world today, right, there's billions of animals. Lots of them are starving right now. Others are being hunted, right? They're experiencing pain all around. So all around the world, there just seems to be evil and suffering of so many different varieties, both moral, both natural with humans, and then with animals, right, who can feel pain. That's the data of our experience. Just looking at the world, you don't need to look far to see it. Evil is the one thing that can be proven just by reading the front page of any newspaper. So that's a significant piece of data. That's the world around us. And this problem, right, of evil and suffering, there's two dimensions to it, right, in terms of a problem for God, right, or an argument against God. There's the intellectual problem, and there's the emotional problem. We're going to tackle the intellectual problem first, and then get into the emotional problem in the last few minutes of the lecture. So the intellectual problem would be that, God, we should not base a belief in God based on the data of the world, right? So it's about the mind, it's about logic, it's about rationality, it's an argument from reason. So it's not reasonable to believe in God because of the suffering in the world, right? That's going to be the intellectual problem. The emotional problem would be to have a disdain for God or a dislike for God because of the evil and suffering in the world. So the first might be, I can't believe in God because of the evil and suffering. It wouldn't make sense, right, based on his nature. The second would be, I don't like God if he permits this, and so I'm going to turn away from him. So, of course, the intellectual problem is the more serious, right, on a reason level. So we're going to spend the majority of the time talking about that, and then we'll spend a few minutes talking about the emotional problem. And for most people, right, as has been observed by many great thinkers, this tends to be an emotional problem. But in terms of a case against God, the more serious problem is the intellectual one. So as an intellectual problem, there are two main formulations of the argument. The first is the logical problem, so the logical problem of evil. The second is the evidential problem, or the probabilistic problem. And so we'll address each of these in turn. So the logical problem is the stronger claim. The logical problem aims to prove that God does not exist. The claim here is that the existence of an omnipotent and omnibenevolent God is incompatible with the presence of evil and suffering in the world. In other words, they're saying that it's a logical impossibility that those two things would be present at the same time. Similar to a married bachelor, right? You couldn't have a married bachelor because you're either married or unmarried, right? You can't be both at the same time, right, in the same way and in the same respect. Or a square circle, right? Either something has edges and sides or it doesn't, right? So just as you couldn't even have these things, they're going to say you couldn't have a world with suffering and the existence of God at the same time. The two things logically could not go together at the same time. So a restatement of the logical problem would be something like, there is no morally sufficient reason that God could have for permitting evil and suffering in the world. That's fundamentally the challenge against the Christian claim. Because what is the theistic claim? The theistic response to the problem of evil is that God can bring about a greater good from it. In other words, that God has a morally sufficient reason for permitting the evil and suffering in the world. That's the only response that Christians can make to it. And so the logical problem, right, the philosopher who's pressing this is arguing that God could not have any morally sufficient reason for doing so. That would be impossible for him to do so. So a formulation of the logical problem would go something like this. First, no morally good being would allow suffering if he were able to prevent it. An omnipotent being would always be able to prevent suffering. Therefore, if there were a morally good, omnipotent being, there would be no suffering. But there is suffering, so therefore, there is no morally good, omnipotent being. So this is a logically valid argument, right? If all the premises are true, if premises 1 through 4 are true, then the conclusion, 5, is going to follow necessarily. So it's impossible for those premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. So as a Christian, you have to ask yourself, which of those 4 premises do you want to reject? It seems that the first premise is the most assailable. So let's look at that. We're going to argue that that premise, no morally good being would allow suffering if you were able to prevent it, is false. And even before we get into a robust critique of it, just think about examples from ordinary experience. So think of an example where you have a father and then a daughter. Let's say a daughter has this doll that she's had for around 3 years and has an emotional connection to it, such that if she lost this doll or if it got ruined, it would bring intense emotional distress to her for a time. There'd be some pain or suffering of some kind that would ensue from a loss of that doll. Now let's say that the daughter is playing outside one evening, and the father knows that the rain is going to start in a couple hours, and so he gets the daughter inside and gets her started on her homework. Now he notices that she's leaving her doll outside, and he knows that that doll is going to get destroyed in the oncoming thunderstorm. But he lets that happen. He lets it happen that the doll gets destroyed in the rain. The daughter finds it in the morning and then is in extreme distress. that she's lost her favorite doll, right? And so she's going through a psychological torment, as it were. That is an instance of suffering. Now, did the father do something morally evil, morally wrong in not preventing that suffering? Not necessarily, because what if he allowed that suffering to decrease the possibility of a greater suffering later on, right? Because what if that child, didn't learn a lesson of what happens when you leave things outside unattended? Because the father just gave her the doll and everything was perfect the next day. So she didn't learn any lesson from that. Then what happens if in 10 years, when she's able to drive, she leaves the car outside, unlocked, and when she goes to school the next morning, when she gets ready to go, the car's gone? Because she never learned that lesson at an early age, that you don't leave things unattended to outside overnight. And then all of a sudden now, the family, including her, is out $50,000. That's a much greater suffering to lose out on that than to lose out on the toy doll, right? So it seems that the parent in that situation would be justified in permitting suffering, namely that he's bringing a greater good out of it, like teaching the daughter a lesson that will prevent and save her from so much stress and suffering of different sorts in the future. So it seems that it is possible, right, for a morally good being to permissibly allow suffering. There doesn't seem to be any contradiction there. And in fact, we can come up with examples like this, which shows that it would be permissible in certain cases. But more robustly, the great Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga offered his famous free will defense as a defeater for the logical problem of evil. And so he's asking this question, right? Is it really contradictory for God to preside over a world with suffering? Is there really a contradiction there? Can those two things really not happen at the same time? Is it really the case, right, that there's no morally sufficient reason that God could have for permitting the evil and suffering in the world, for permitting any of it? Well, he notes a couple of observations. So first, it seems that the greatest conceivable good, or at least a very great good, is a free creature who has the potential to do either good or evil, and yet chooses the good. Somebody who has the genuine possibility of choosing selfishness or hate, but chooses love instead, and chooses selflessness instead. That's extremely valuable. And it seems that all else held equal, a world with free creatures is better than a world with no free creatures. Because if in a world with no free creatures, you can never have that great good actualized. That can only be actualized in a world where there are free creatures. As Plantinga writes, a world containing creatures who are significantly free and freely perform more good than evil actions is more valuable, all else held equal, than a world containing no free creatures at all. So if you even want the possibility of that good, you need free creatures, you need free persons. So there's nothing contradictory about God creating free creatures. That's the next note. Now the next is that God cannot cause someone to freely choose something. That's logically impossible, right? So you might ask, okay, well, yeah, maybe people choosing the morally good thing with their free will is a great good, and a world is better, right, if it has that than if it doesn't. But then why can't God make it such that they're only using their free will to choose the good? They're not using it ever to choose the bad, so you wouldn't have no, at least moral evil in the world. Well, the problem is, you can't make someone freely do something. That's a contradiction in terms, right? If you make someone do it, then they're not free anymore. So then you don't have that free choice to choose the good over the bad. You don't have that, right? If you're making them do it. So, and God can't do the logically impossible because that doesn't exist, that cannot be done, it isn't a thing in itself. Then God can't make it such that people are not doing any evil. So God cannot control in a world with free creatures whether or not there is evil, aside from setting up the possibility for it, which is needed to even have the possibility for the good. So there could be a possible world created by God that features evil and suffering. And if that's true, if there's a possible world where that's allowed, then it follows that there's no logical problem here. It follows that there's no logical contradiction between the existence of an all-good, all-powerful, and all-loving God and evil and suffering in the world. Because it seems there can be goods that can only come from a world where evil is possible. And so, philosophers of all sides have widely agreed that planting as free will defense constitutes a decisive defeater of the logical problem of evil. He's demonstrated that there is no contradiction there and that there is a possibility that the two could coexist. Whereas that's not the case with genuine contradictions like a merry bachelor or a square circle. So now that the logical problem is widely recognized to have failed, the atheist philosophers who still push the problem of evil as reason to think that God doesn't exist instead modify the argument to make it more modest. They make it more modest in the form of the evidential problem of evil and suffering. Or in other words, the probabilistic problem of evil and suffering. So the aim of this argument is to show that God probably does not exist. So not that there's no way that he exists, right? Evil and suffering disproves God's existence, but that evil and suffering makes it that God probably doesn't exist, right? So God probably wouldn't be presiding over a world with evil and suffering and with this particular amount of evil and suffering that we see. So the claim here is that with all of the evil and suffering in the world, it is unlikely or improbable that an omnipotent and omnibenevolent God exists and created this world and presides over it. You'll notice that the language difference is there. This is probabilistic, right? So it's not proof anymore. It's not logical. It's just what's more probable. So they're saying, what's an inference to the best explanation of the evil and suffering in the world? The best inference is that there isn't an all-good and all-powerful God who's at the origin of all of it. So to restate that claim, they're saying that there is probably no morally sufficient reason that God could have for permitting all of the evil and suffering in the world. So it's a probability judgment, the evidential problem. To look at a precise formulation of what it might look like, 1, no morally good being would fail to prevent suffering if he were able to prevent it, unless he had good reasons to permit it. So notice now that first premise has been modified, right? Now it's permissible to allow suffering as a morally good being if you have a good reason to permit it. And otherwise, it's not permissible to preside over it. 2, an omnipotent being would always be able to prevent suffering. 3, probably there is no good reason that a morally good, omnipotent being could have for failing to prevent suffering. Therefore, if there were a morally good, omnipotent being, then probably there would be no suffering. But, again, there is suffering, so therefore, probably there is no being who is both morally good and omnipotent. So that's the technical formulation of the evidential problem. And again, too, right, I want to draw another distinction here, this time between the global problem of evil and then the local problem. Because I think there can be a temptation sometimes, right, amongst Christians to only focus on the global problem, whereas the strongest, right, formulation of the problem of evil is going to be in the form of the local problem. So the global, right, examines things from a macro level perspective, just suffering as such, right? So does God have a reason for permitting any suffering in the world, right? That's the global perspective. Is like, how is the whole world looking, right? Is it permissible for him to permit any suffering in the world? So the person who's pressing a global problem of evil would ask, why is there suffering in the world? The person pressing the local problem, which is again the more serious one, might ask, why is God permitting all of these particular instances of suffering, each one individually? So not, why is there suffering in the world? Maybe there's some good that can come from some suffering, right? Like, for example, learning a lesson about leaving things outside. But I'm not asking like globally what's the reason for suffering in general. I'm asking what's the reason for this child right here who is developmentally disabled to a very high degree. What about that family right there that lost 2 kids in a car accident 5 years ago? Or that deer that's burning in the forest over there from a forest fire? Or that lion, right, who got injured and so can't hunt and will spend the next week starving to death in a very painful way? What good is coming out of that? What good is coming out of that? So the atheist philosopher Louis Antony writes, when we confront seriously the amount of suffering in the world, fawns dying in fires, children struck with painful illness, adults enduring pointless depression, and consider the way that it is distributed, afflictions heaped disproportionately on the poor and the vulnerable, I think the rational conclusion to draw is that there is no good reason for it. So not what good is coming from suffering or what good can potentially come from suffering, but what good is coming from this individual instance of suffering that I'm examining right now. And then, of course, you can multiply that question by a factor of, right, essentially infinity, right, of all the billions and trillions of instances of suffering throughout the history of the world, right? What's the reason for each individual one? Now, there are 2 possible theistic responses, right, to the problem of evil. I call one the ambitious response and the other the modest response. So the ambitious response would be that suffering provides no evidence against God. It does not constitute any reason to doubt God's existence. So it provides no evidential force in favor of atheism. Now the more modest approach would contend that suffering does provide some evidence against God, but not decisive evidence. So the ambitious theist might say, there are no good reasons to think that God does not exist. Whereas the modest theist might say, there are not comparably good reasons to think that God does not exist, to turn to that first slide we had. So the modest theist here would essentially have to argue that suffering constitutes what's called C-inductive evidence against God, but not P-inductive evidence. So those are terms that originate with, or at least are popularized by Richard Swinburne, a great Oxford philosopher, Christian. And he distinguishes the 2 types of evidence for a given hypothesis. So C-inductive evidence is evidence that makes a hypothesis more likely, whereas P-inductive evidence is evidence that makes a hypothesis more probable than not, right? Makes it more likely than not. So for example, let's say I have this claim that my uncle is a great golfer. Now what if, you ask me, okay, what's your evidence for that? And I say, well, he has a very expensive set of golf clubs. Okay, that gives us some good evidence, right, to think that he's a great golfer, right? Why would he spend so much money on clubs if he wasn't even good at the sport, right? That seems like a waste of money. So that seems like some reason to accept that claim, right, to think that it's true. It's certainly some evidence in its favor. But it's not knocked down evidence, right? It doesn't, not only is it not knocked down, it's not even probabilistic evidence, right? It doesn't make it more probable than not, because he could just be a very rich man. And so, yeah, he spent a lot of money in clubs, but what's a lot of money for the average person isn't a lot for him, right? So, yeah, it doesn't make it more probable than not. He just might have a lot of money. But what if instead I told you that last year he won the biggest championship competition in the state of Michigan? Well, all of a sudden now, right, you've got a lot better of a reason to think that he's a great golfer. And in fact, reason that maybe tips the scale to over 50%, right, likelihood that he is a great golfer. Because it seems like to win a competition, especially a big one like that, you're going to need to be great. So, for example, C-inductive evidence might bring the right probability of a hypothesis from 20% likelihood of being true to, let's say 35%, whereas P-inductive evidence would bring it to above 50%. So what the theist would have to claim here is that, okay, if I'm going to grant, right, that evil does give some reason to think that God doesn't exist, provide some evidence against that theistic hypothesis, it only makes it less likely that God exists, but it doesn't make it less likely than not, right? It doesn't raise that probability to over 50% that God doesn't exist. And one of the ways that they'll claim that is by saying that you can't just look at one set of the data, you have to look at the totality of the data. And when you look at the totality of the data, right, of the human experience and of observation of the universe and philosophical reflection, it seems that the case for God overwhelms the case against him. There are so many more arguments, and they are stronger, right, than the arguments against God. And so, right, what the modest theist might say is something like, while theism may not predict a world that looks like this, right, that has so much evil and suffering, that has all these individual instances that it might seem like no good is coming from, it predicts so many other features of the world that naturalism does not, that atheism does not, and so should be preferred over atheism. So on balance, theism is the better hypothesis to explain the total set of the data presented to us. That's going to be the modest approach. So it seems that, of course, the ambitious, right, response is going to take a lot more, right? So first, looking at the modest, right, a couple things you're going to have to do. First, you're going to have to defend and bolster the arguments for God's existence. So if you're going to say that, theism makes a better prediction of all the data, then you need to show that, right? You need to back that up by increasing the evidential force of the arguments for God, and likewise, diminish the evidential force of evil and suffering. So the modest theist is going to have to show, okay, here's why, evil and suffering don't provide that much evidence against God. Here's why they don't amount to P inductive evidence. Here's why it only amounts to C inductive evidence. So that's going to be the task of the modest theist. Whereas the ambitious theist is going to have to extinguish the evidential force of evil and suffering. He's going to have to show why evil and suffering does not constitute any reason to think that God does not exist. So clearly the ambitious task is going to be much harder. But in any case, they both are trending in the same direction in terms of the response, right? They're going to at least be starting at the same place. So what does it actually look like, right? Diminishing the evidential force of evil and suffering. So again, right, what is the fundamental response of the theist to the problem of evil? It's that God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting evil and suffering in the world, namely the bringing about of a greater good. So what that means is the world would be greater given that there's suffering than it would have been in a world with no suffering. Because certain goods can only arise through evil and suffering. So the world is greater with evil and suffering than without it. And so that's God's morally sufficient reason, is a greater world. Now the atheistic claim, on the other hand, is that God probably does not have morally sufficient reasons for permitting all the suffering in the world. So what the atheist is claiming is that probably the world would not be better with the evil and suffering than without it. So those are the two competing claims here. Now, a couple of considerations. First, an omnipotent God could bring a great and greater good out of every instance of suffering. Of every individual, right, instance of suffering, of all the billions and trillions of examples that have transpired throughout history, a God who was all-powerful, who has no limit on what he can do, would be able to bring a greater good out of every single instance. So that's important to keep in mind. The question is, does he? Is he doing so? Is he bringing good out of every single instance of suffering that's transpired? Is that actually happening? The atheistic claim is that it does not seem like any good is coming from so much of the suffering. And so atheists have a term for this. This is called gratuitous suffering. So suffering which is pointless, suffering which no good comes from, is referred to as gratuitous suffering. So the atheist claim is that there is probably gratuitous suffering, and God probably would not allow gratuitous suffering, or some might say he definitely would not allow it, depending on the atheist. So now let's begin the task of actually diminishing the evidential force of the problem of evil. So first, what theists can claim is that we are not in a strong position to make such probability judgments. Think about it. We are finite creatures, so we're creatures that have finite intellects, right? Everybody has some IQ of X, right? And it could have been greater. And it could have been much greater, right? So we're finite beings in our intellect. We're finite beings in our understanding. We, can only see a certain percentage of the universe. We only know so much that has happened, right, throughout, the history of the world. So we're finite also in our understanding, right, in addition to our intellect. And we're finite in our perspective, right, in terms of the scope of what we can observe, of the story of reality that unfolds, right, over the millennia. So thinking about it from our limited perspectives, right? So think about the perspective of a human being, right? We're existing for 70 years, right? That's all we get, 70 years. In this one part of the world, in this one tucked away corner of the universe. How can we say that this individual instance of suffering that we're examining is not going to be able to be used for God, right? By God for a greater good? That there isn't a greater good that's going to be brought by this or that already has been brought about by this? How could we possibly say that from our vantage point, which is so limited, which is unbelievably limited? By contrast, think about God, right, who is timeless and who's looking at the universe all at once. He's looking at the story of history all at once, all at the same time, right? That person, right, that being is going to be in a much greater place to assess whether or not, right, good is coming out of all these instances of suffering. It doesn't seem like we're in any place to do that. It doesn't seem like we're in any place at all to do that. The Catholic apologist Trent Horn gives the following example in his book, The Case for Catholicism. Imagine if you got kidnapped one day, a bag thrown over your head, and you were brought to this building that you didn't know, right, what it was, and then you're plopped, right, nose on this canvas, and all you can see is darkness in front of you. You might think, oh, this is something really ugly, right, what I'm looking at right now. I don't understand it. Why is it all so dark? I don't even see anything. What's the point of this darkness? Now imagine if somebody took you 10 steps backward, and then what you were looking at was the Mona Lisa, right? And what the dark part you were looking at was the hair, right, up close. Clearly then, right, that hair, that darkness of the hair contributes to the beauty of the picture. But you couldn't see that unless you had a macro level perspective of the whole portrait. And so similar to how things might look, right, meaningless or dark, right, up close, removed from the context of everything else, it might really seem that it's for nothing. But then when you take a step back and you can see everything at once, you can see how it actually contributes to a greater beauty of the whole story, and that the picture would be better if that darkness was there than if it wasn't. And so it just doesn't seem that we're in a good epistemic position to make those probability judgments, right? How can the atheist say that God probably is not bringing good out of these instances of suffering? How could he possibly say that when all he has are 70 years on this earth, right? And is limited in his intellect and his understanding. How can he possibly make those probability judgments? They just seem way too ambitious. They just don't seem to be justified. Now, there's a different formulation of this line of reasoning that's called skeptical theism. So skeptical theism is the view that, assuming that theism is true, we should be skeptical of our abilities to reasonably predict all of God's plans for organizing the world. And so what it does, right, is it's going to cast doubt on our ability to classify any evils as gratuitous, right, as meaningless. So the idea here is that, we would not be able, as finite creatures, to track the will of God and to track God's designs, right? There's just so, our ability to ascertain the will of God and the design plans of God for the universe and for the story of, non-fundamental reality are unreliable. They're not reliable. We wouldn't be able to pick up on things that he's intending or that he's designed, right? At least a lot of the time. So it draws this great chasm between us and God based on the fact that we're finite and that he's infinite. So the philosopher Perry Hendricks gives the following analogy. An adult is driving in a car with a toddler in the back seat, and the left blinker on the car in front of him suddenly turns on. It is a good reason for the adult to think the car is about to turn left. But it is not, however, a good reason for the toddler to think that the car is going to turn left, because it's just a blinking light to them. We are interested in recognizable reasons here, right? So, we might see an instance of suffering and not be moved and not be enlightened as to how that's going to work for good. But that doesn't mean there isn't something greater going on there, right? It doesn't mean that there actually isn't good coming from it just because we can't see it in that moment. But who can see it is the infinite creator and designer of the universe. And also think about it this way, right? There are instances of evil where good ensues that we missed out on because of our limitations. Think of an example where you come to have a neighbor, right, that moves in to the house next door to you for a brief period of time. And they, the mom gives birth to a child that's heavily developmentally disabled. Now imagine the mom in that household gives birth to a child that is heavily developmentally disabled. Now you might think, okay, that's a great, right, natural evil, right? That's a great, imperfection that's going to cause a lot of, turmoil and stress for the family. That child is never going to have like a full experience of life in the same way that you or and I could. That seems like that's an instance of gratuitous evil, right? There's no good that's going to come from that. And the family moves away, right? After a short time, they think, okay, we need different living accommodations for this child. So you don't know how the story ends. You might think gratuitous evil is a good reason to think that God doesn't exist. But what if that child actually ended up living an enjoyable life? And what if it taught the family and all the people around the family so much compassion and so much concern for those who have been given less, and has caused them to treat everyone in their lives better, and has caused them to give lots and lots of money to charitable organizations of many kinds, and that improved the lives of dozens of others? Well, you would have missed that. You'd have missed all that good. You made the judgment based on the evil without consideration of the good. Why did you make that judgment? Because you weren't aware of the good. And why weren't you aware of that good? Because of your finitude. Because you're limited in time and space. You can't be everywhere at once. And you're limited in your intellect, so you can't see how things would play out, right? You're limited in your knowledge. So it seems that there are so many instances of evil where good ensues, or at least has the possibility to ensue. And we're missing a lot of those. And so, if we're missing so many of these instances, then how many more are we missing due to our limitations? There could be so many that we're missing that we don't even know about. So it seems again that the atheist just is not in the right place to make such probability judgments because of our finitude and our limitedness. Next, we need to ask ourselves, right, what is God's purpose? So the atheist is claiming that God would not allow this to happen, right? God would not allow all these instances of suffering. But why? Why are you saying he wouldn't allow that? How do you know what he actually wants, right? What does God want? Now, if your view is that God's desire for the world is for it to just be a play area, a comfortable play area for us as his pets, and he's just a sort of babysitter, well then yeah, evil and suffering is going to constitute irrefutable evidence against God, right? If that's his fundamental purpose. But why are you assuming that's his fundamental purpose? Right? It may be the case that Christianity is true, or something else, right? It may be the case that God has a different purpose besides a comfortable world, namely, to bring the maximal number of free creatures into a loving relationship with himself that will last forever. That may genuinely be the case. That's a possibility. And it may be the case that that can only be achieved in a world suffused with suffering. So you have to ask yourself, ask yourself what the goalpost is. Is it just, what goods arise in this world? Or could there be another world, which is certainly possible given the existence of God? And it may be the case that in order to get the most amount of people in the great state in that other world, like heaven, that we might have to go through turmoil and trial in this world to make that decision valuable, or to actually help us desire that, or to increase the number of people that are there in some way. So you can't criticize the world when you don't know the purpose of the world. The purpose of the world may not be comfort. It may be greatness, as Pope Benedict said. You cannot criticize the purpose. You cannot criticize a design without knowing the purpose of the designer. So, for example, you couldn't have somebody that looked at this laptop that I'm giving this presentation on and said, oh, this laptop is incapable of sending a rocket ship into outer space. So this is a bad laptop because it can't do something. It's on a deal in some way. But hold on a second, right? What if the laptop wasn't designed for that? What if the laptop was designed to make PowerPoint presentations on and then write essays on? Then it's not a bad laptop because the laptop wasn't meant to do that, right? Something's bad if it fails to fulfill its function, right? So you cannot criticize the design without knowing the purpose of the designer. And you need to know what God's purpose is before you can say, he made a bad world for accomplishing that purpose, if you don't even know what it is. Fourth, there's this idea of soul building. And so this idea would say that evil and suffering are necessary for the moral and spiritual development of humans. So on this view, the world is a sort of spiritual training ground, or a veil of soul making, where humans, through free will and overcoming challenges, can grow from moral immaturity into virtuous beings closer to God's likeness. So this is a view that goes back to St. Irenaeus, but has been defended by modern philosophers like John Hick. It's that, essentially, suffering and challenges are necessary for growth. So virtues include courage, compassion, wisdom, suffering, perseverance. These can only arise in situations that involve suffering. So think of something like virtue, or think of something like bravery or courage. Well, if you define courage as, doing the right thing, right, in the face of danger, well, you need danger in order to cultivate courage, right? In order for perseverance, you need trial and hardship, which is going to necessarily, right, almost definitionally involve suffering. What about compassion? In order to develop the virtue of compassion, you're going to need a situation where people are in an unfortunate situation that's going to involve suffering. And so you have to ask, right, is it better, all else held equal, for there to be courageous people, or compassionate people, or persevering people? I think so, but yet you can only have that if there's suffering in the world. So it may be the case that that the only way we could reach our true potentials, right, would be if we cultivated these virtues, which necessitate there being suffering as prerequisites for building that virtue, right? All else held equal, it's better for there to be a compassionate person, right, than for there to be a person who never even had the possibility of being compassionate, right? I think that's a better world, and so God is in his prerogative for creating a world with conditions that would allow for that. So this is what's known as the soul-building theodicy. And think about this, right? What is the greatest act of love conceivable? It would be Jesus on the cross. This idea of a God who is infinite and who's perfect, and who's the creator, the transcendent creator and designer of the universe, coming down, entering the human story, and then dying on a Roman instrument of torture for the salvation of the world, to experience the suffering that we deserve for sin, to satisfy God's justice and liberate us from penalty to sin. That's the greatest act of love imaginable. the perfect God dying for wretched, sinful, selfish people, even though he was innocent and deserved none of it. You could not think of any act greater than that the perfect being going and doing something like that. It's not even in principle possible to think of something better than that. And yet, in order to have that such a powerful expression and display of love, you need suffering. You need to see that God was both willing and able and determined to bring us to himself so much that he would take on suffering. So it seems that there are great goods, especially the greatest conceivable act of good, which can only arise in a context of suffering. And so if that's the case, then how can we say that God is not in his right to permit suffering if certain goods can only be achieved in a world with suffering, like our Lord going to the cross? And then lastly, we can think of a natural framework for thinking about the issue. So, and this is actually my view on the matter, in addition to all the other 5 reasons, of course, I think that God has morally sufficient reasons for creating us in a natural universe, right? There's certain goods that can obtain from, being in a material world and having a body and being composites of spirit and body, right? Of body and soul. And for creating the laws of nature that he did and for the world that he did, right? He had morally sufficient reasons for doing so. Now, the laws that he brought about and the physical states of affairs that he created enable opportunities for both good and bad, for ideal and unideal. So, gravity, for instance, allows us to walk around and not float freely in the air, but it also causes avalanches. It also causes falls to death. So it's something that, good and bad comes from. Biological complexity and development, right, of life that causes us, right, to grow, right, both from species to species, but also just on a micro level, right, within a species and also as persons. But also that allows for, bad replications of cells and allows for diseases and death. So these natural sorts of laws and then conditions enable both good and bad. And we need that good, right, in a material world. So then why is the bad there? Why doesn't God remove the bad? Well, I think if we live in a world that's self-sustaining, right, so you don't need God intervening at every second and causing every tree to grow or every person to remain on the ground, but has these laws and has these regularities that can allow for both, it seems like he's going to let that world be in a certain way. He's not going to be constantly intervening. There'd be something deficient about that world if it needed constant intervention in order to work. In addition to that, though, I think we would have decisive proof of his existence in a world like that, right? In a world like that, we have decisive proof of his existence. So I don't think that God wants that, right? The great, and this is actually the solution to the problem of evil, but the great mathematician Blaise Pascal famously said that God has given sufficient evidence for those whose hearts are open, but not enough evidence so as to coerce those whose hearts are closed. I think that the choice to pursue God and to skirt evil and sin is so much more valuable if you don't have a guarantee that God actually exists, or that you're going to fight sin and reject evil, even though there's the possibility that you could get away with everything scot-free. But yet, you still choose to avoid evil, and you still choose to pursue the good and to pursue God, even though it may all be for nothing in the end of it. But you still choose him. That's an immensely valuable choice. That's an immensely valuable choice. It's an incommensurable good in many ways. And so, even Jesus, right, thinks of things, in similar ways when he says to Thomas, right, in John, post-resurrection, "You believe in me, Thomas, because you have seen me. Blessed are those who have not seen me and yet still believe." So there's a certain praiseworthiness of believing even though you don't have full evidence. And I think that's why God ultimately remains hidden and remains at an arm's length and obscures his existence. But yet, if he was intervening every single time the laws of nature and the physical conditions would lead to a bad outcome, somebody falling off a cliff, he raises them up from that and prevents gravity from working in that instance. Or somebody's about to burn their hand on a stove, right? He makes it cold, right in that instance. I think that would be a world that was very psychologically, tumultuous. I think that would drive us crazy. But then I think also we'd have absolute proof of his existence, which I think he doesn't want us to have in the ordinary circumstances. So those are 6 good reasons, I think, to doubt this notion that, we can say confidently that God has no morally sufficient reasons, or at least probably doesn't, for permitting the evil and suffering in the world that he does. Very quickly, we'll go over a slew of Swinburnian arguments. These are arguments that go back to Richard Swinburne, the great Oxford philosopher. So he's speaking here about, natural evils, right? Because moral evils are easily solvable, right? The supreme ethic, right, in the world, in reality, is love, is the gift of oneself to another. And love necessitates freedom, the ability to choose, to give of yourself, right, rather than to remain selfish. So love requires freedom. Freedom can be used for good or bad. That's outside of God's control. So it's not, nobody really holds God liable for the moral evil, right, because love is so supreme. So the big, right, instance of evil that's held against God is the natural evil, is the suffering that comes about through non-free will. So Swinburne is going to argue that natural evil provides opportunities for especially valuable kinds of emotional response and free choice. So there's still going to be great goods that are coming from natural evils, for instance. So we'll go through these quickly. There's the great good of compassion, right? And that can only be felt if others are suffering, as we explained earlier. He writes, a world with some pain and some compassion is at least as good as a world with no pain and so no compassion. It is good that the range of our compassion should be wide, extending far in space and time. Right? The world is better for there being such a concern. So, for example, if suffering began, right, the moment when each of us began, right, the suffering that we were aware of, that's good that we would have compassion for the beings going through that. But if suffering has been happening for so long, we have compassion for all of that. How much more compassionate are we? And being, very, very compassionate is a great good. And so suffering that extends far into the past, right, maybe in terms of animal history, would enable us to be all the more compassionate. Certain kinds of especially valuable free choices are possible only as responses to evil. So there's that, famous cliche phrase, life is 10% what happens to you and 90% how you respond to it. And so if there are certain, right, responses that can only come from evil, and those responses are praiseworthy and valuable, God may be in his right, in his moral right to permit them. And then more generally, each bad action or state of affairs gives to the victims, perpetrators, and observers a free choice of how to react by actions good or bad. And that's ultimately what God is looking for. It's how we respond to the world around us, and how we respond to the light he has given us, how we respond to the good, how we respond to love, but also how we respond to evil. Do we partake in it? Do we close in on ourselves? Or do we look outwards and live our lives for other people and for him? And do we die to ourselves? And do we take up our cross? And so, bad, instances in nature, suffering, gives us ample opportunities to make that choice, to choose the good, to choose love, or to choose something else. So it does seem that, natural evils can be used for that as well as moral evils. And one could argue that many of these goods could be realized strictly, right, from opportunities stemming from moral evils, but again, so many may come from natural evils as well. What about animal suffering, right? This is increasingly popular, right, this issue of animal suffering, as we as a Western society are especially attuned to the suffering and the well-being of animals right nowadays, and perhaps rightly so, though of course people can go overboard with this. There are essentially two responses to animal suffering that the theist can give. The first is that animals are not cognitively advanced beings, right? So if animals are not cognitively advanced, right, and they're not cognitively advanced enough to have really serious experiences of pain, then the problem of animal suffering greatly diminishes. If they're not even experiencing that much suffering, if at all, then it's not really a big deal that these physical things are happening to them. But if animals are cognitively advanced enough to have serious experiences of pain, then it is plausible that they could be rewarded in an eternal afterlife, in the presence of an infinitely good God. So basically, if animals are more cognitively sophisticated, maybe they could be in heaven. And if they're in heaven, if they're in the presence of God in some sense and experiencing that bliss, then that's going to make up for the life of suffering that they endured on earth. Because first of all, the life on earth, right, of your typical animal is not just a giant gore fest. It's not suffering from life to death. There's usually a mix of pains and pleasures in there. But in any case, that mixed bag of a life is going to be just dwarfed by everlasting bliss in heaven in the presence of God, which these animals might experience. And many theologians, both Catholic and Protestant, are open to the possibility of animals in heaven. And so either way, I think that we can make sense of animal suffering. At least we have the beginnings, of a story that might explain it or diminish that problem. But we've only talked so far about the intellectual problem, about why, it may not be the case that the existence, the presence of evil and suffering is surprising or unexpected given the theistic hypothesis, right? It may not be the case that it constitutes evidence against God, or at least not that much evidence against God. But that's only the intellectual question. But for most people, they're not really pressing the intellectual objection. They're pressing the emotional one. Their reason for not coming to a loving relationship with God is not because they don't believe in Him, because they can't, because they think there's a contradiction or at least a great improbability, but because they don't like a God who would allow them or the people that they love to go through horrendous suffering. This is the emotional problem. They don't want to worship a God like that. They certainly don't want to give their lives to Him. What is the Christian claim in response to the horrendous reality of evil and suffering in the world? Essentially, it's to look to the cross and embrace the reality and to rejoice in the reality that God suffers with us. That in going to the cross and taking on the sins of the world, Jesus, the Lord God, entered into solidarity with the brokenness of this world. The cross of Christ tells us that God isn't this carefree being who looks at us with apathy and who presides, over the suffering of the world, thinking nothing of it. What it tells us, rather, is that He thinks everything of it. He's going to go into it and then take the worst of it onto Himself, fundamentally for our sake. God suffers with us. This concept of divine suffering is so radical that it's not taught in any other religion. Because think about it. God is so greatly above us, so much greater than us, finite and sinful beings. We get on our knees, we get on the ground just to even talk to Him. And yet the idea that He's going to do something for us, He's going to take on suffering for us, is remarkable. And yet Christianity flips the script in terms of expectation. Jesus says, the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give His life as a ransom for all. And this is so beautiful because what no man would dare to say about God, that He would suffer for His own creation, the real God goes and does it, and decisively demonstrates beyond a shadow of a doubt that He loves us, that He cares about us, and that He has prepared everything for us. And so, we may not like, a God who permits that suffering, but in those moments when you feel that way, look to the cross. Yes, he does permit a world with suffering, but the one thing we can't say is that he doesn't care. Look to the cross. Study what crucifixion entailed, and then answer the question of whether or not you think he cares about us and cares about our suffering. Because he's demonstrated it in the strongest possible terms. And so, whether you are dealing with the problem of evil and suffering in an intellectual way or an emotional way, Christianity can make sense of it. And so, in the end, I don't think that the problem of evil works. In the end, the problem of evil does not constitute serious evidence against the hypothesis that there's an all-loving and all-powerful God at the heart of reality who's fashioned creation according to his will. And so, we can claim, for now, that there are good reasons for thinking that God exists, and at least that there are not comparably good reasons for thinking that God does not exist. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next week.